Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together.
Okay, guys, we're back. Welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. This is your host, Clay Bowers, and I'm joined by my other host, Luke Oswald. And we're here with Langdon Cook. Langdon is this guy that I heard of a couple years ago when I was perusing my local bookstore, and I found this book called The Mushroom Hunters, and I was immediately like, this is awesome. I got to read it. And a couple years goes by. I find him on social media, and I invited him to come onto the podcast. Langdon, please explain to the audience who you are and how you got into mushroom hunting.
Of course. First of all, it's great to be with you guys. Thank you for having me. So I've been into mushroom hunting for 30 plus years. I'm a writer now, but the mushroom hunting actually predates the writing. In a way, my material kind of found me, but it took a while. I started writing about wild foods maybe 15 years ago. And since then, I've written 3 books. I consider it my wild food trilogy on there's the mushroom hunters that we're going to talk about, and another book on Pacific salmon called Upstream. And my first book is just a collection of personal essays about wild foods and foraging called Fat of the Land. In addition to writing, I teach classes and, do other sort of related things like that.
Yeah. How did you get into mushroom hunting? Was it your parents or was it just like your own interest?
I've been a nature geek since I was a kid. I grew up in New England. We had, 3.5 acres out back and woods that for the first 7 years of my life, I was an only child until my sister came along. And so I had to occupy myself. I was just into turning over rocks and looking for bugs and putting them in terrariums and that kind of stuff and running around the woods. And that just stayed with me. I've been a bird watcher since I was young. When I got to the West Coast, I kind of fell in, this is my early 20s, fell in with a crew that just enjoyed being outdoors, but also enjoyed finding wild foods as sort of part of the experience, which is something I hadn't done before. So, if we went salmon fishing, well, maybe there was a beach with some oysters on it, or we might dig some clams. If we went backpacking, oh, look, there's some morels over there. Let's, put that in the camp pot, that sort of thing. And over time, more and more wild foods just kind of landed on my plate. And I realized I just had sort of a whole repertoire of foods that I'd like to go, chase in the woods or the shore, as it may be. And then at a certain point, they became my subject matter. I realized what incredible characters they are in their own right. I mean, they're delicious and they have great life histories and they're fun to find, but they're charismatic and they're individuals in a way. And so they became kind of like my characters and just started writing first these essays and then doing sort of longer journalistic pieces on wild foods and the people who pursue them, because of course they're just as interesting as the foods. And so it's kind of that intersection of food, nature, and the outdoors where I've kind of planted my flag.
That's awesome. So I've noticed something that's kind of interesting, and maybe you could illuminate me on this. Why is it called mushroom hunting? I've always been kind of like curious about that. When you go out to like forage for plants, like that's kind of my area of expertise would be more plants. And I do some mushroom hunting, but nobody says I'm going to go out plant hunting, but people do say mushroom hunting. And you're the writer. Why is that, you think?
It might be similar to why do we call it fishing rather than catching?
No.
Because, you could go out and hunt for mushrooms, but that doesn't mean you're coming home with a full basket, does it? I think we've all experienced getting skunked out there in
Yeah.
the woods, and I don't know, maybe the hunting aspect of it, just calling it hunting, kind of gives it this added kind of romance. I'm not really sure, but we're out on the hunt, and
Mhm.
it's activating all these kind of primitive sort of buttons that we have inside us that we've carried within us since antiquity. I mean, as someone pointed out to me, we're descendants of successful foragers from the
Mhm.
deep past, and we have this kind of this need to fulfill the sort of hunting experience within us. I mean, everybody, whether you live in a city or out in the country, whether you're into that sort of thing or not, it's kind of there, just waiting to be discovered. When I'm teaching my classes, it's just amazing to see people who have really no foraging experience, who have hardly been in the woods, and you get them out there, and when they find their first mushroom or wild plant or berry, I mean, they just go nuts. There
Mhm.
is just something. There's of course the treasure hunt. There's that aspect, which is another part of kind of mushroom hunting, the treasure hunt. But it's something we all carry within us, and it's a matter of just getting in touch with it.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say teach your classes, you're talking about like botany classes or foraging classes or um, what type of classes?
So I actually teach wild food foraging classes out here. I live in Seattle, and mostly in spring and fall. Those are sort of my two big seasons for doing it. I take a break in the summer, but in the spring, that's a great time for wild greens, and then of course in fall mushrooms. But of course, we have all sorts of different wild foods here in the Pacific Northwest, just the way you have all sorts of different foods where you are. They have a seasonality to them, and even if something isn't fruiting, you can point out, what it looks like at that stage in its life cycle to folks, just so they can see it. I mean, I always encourage people to find, a nice hike nearby from where they live and just go do it like once a month, every
Mhm.
month throughout the year, and just see how all these different species are kind of changing over the course of their life cycle. And then you can recognize them at any time and go back when it's appropriate to harvest. Um, but uh, but yeah, I teach wild food classes. I do shellfish classes on the coast, which are a heck of a lot of fun. I mean, we pick clams or dig clams and pick oysters. Sometimes if it's really low tides, we'll dig gooey ducks, and then we cook everything up on camp stoves, just overlooking Puget Sound. It's a blast.
That sounds awesome.
Now, does everybody need a license for that?
So I actually, my partner in the shellfish classes is a third generation oyster grower
Hmm.
with a home right on the South Sound,
Wow.
and so we're actually on his property. So technically, they don't need licenses.
Okay.
But for if you're a Washington resident, you can get a shellfish license for something like $10 or $12 for the year. And so just
Ooh.
yeah, exactly. And you can gather shellfish and seaweed with that license.
Hmm.
So basically, your first day out, you've paid for it.
There you
Nice.
go.
Yeah, and if you get a gooey duck that weighs a few pounds, well, I don't know if you've ever seen those in the market, but around
Hmm.
here, I mean, they go, for a hefty sum.
I've never seen one in the market, but I've seen them. Seen a lot of them on social media these days. Um, so, how are you even cooking the gooey duck? That's one thing that I've always kind of been curious about. I see it made in a lot of Asian dishes, but is there like an American spin on that? Is there like a coastal spin? What are you guys doing that's different than the traditional Asian dishes with it?
Right. So there are definitely Asian, especially Japanese dishes, and we do some of those. And then I do my own spins on it. But let's back up a second and just explain to the audience what a gooey duck is. It is the largest burrowing clam in the world. Now, you might when you hear burrowing clam, you might think, "Oh, it can dig itself to safety when you're trying to catch it." No, once it burrows down to its lair when it's just when it's young, when it's a baby, and then that's it. It's 3 feet basically below the surface, for the rest of its life, which could be 200 years. And they can be quite old.
Wow.
Yes. And it stays there. So the key to digging a gooey duck is to find where it lives, and then dig it up. And of course, you're racing the tide. You can only dig these on the lowest tides of the year, which is usually around the summer solstice. So May, June, early July are the times when most of us are digging gooey ducks out here in Puget Sound, and they can be huge. I mean, I've heard of double-digit poundage gooey ducks, 11, 12 pounds. I've never seen one that big. I think I've seen one as big as 7 pounds. More typical would be sort of, 2 to 3 pounds. But still, that's a lot of meat. And it is incredibly delicious. I tell people, if you like clams, you're going to like gooey duck because it's a clammy clam. Lots of flavor, also lots of texture. It's a very al dente clam. So in terms of preparing it, typically what we'll do is once we get the gooey duck out of the ground, which is just a fiasco, in itself. I mean, it's so much fun to watch my students in their fishing waders, like on their bellies, reaching their arms, like, shoulder deep. Often, I mean, I have seen, students go completely underwater to try and get a gooey duck, I mean, literally head under, practically snorkeling, trying to get that thing out of the ground as the tide comes in. They know, that the clock is ticking. Like they have to take drastic measures to get that thing because they're sort of fastened into the ground, sort of suctioned into their layers. And you have to break that suction. You have to really get kind of under the shell. In the Nisqually tribal language, gooey duck basically means dig deep. And they are way down there. And so it's really fun just getting them out of the ground. And then in terms of preparing them, we'll just stick them in a vat of boiling water for, 8 to 10 seconds. And at that point, you can kind of clean them. So take them out of the shell. You have to sort of remove this sort of outer layer on the siphon. And then you remove what's known, colloquially as the gut ball. And that's, other people will refer to that with other species of shellfish as the dark parts. It's like, the lungs and stomach and stuff like that. I'm sure it makes great crab bait, but we don't eat that. And so you're left with the body meat and the neck meat. And with the neck meat, I will typically do that in the Japanese style, just as sashimi. So it got briefly boiled and that's it. I'm not cooking it at all. With the body meat, I love to dice it up and throw it in the wok and make a stir fry. It kind of plumps up as soon as it hits the hot wok, and it's absolutely delicious. And actually, in spring, my favorite thing to do is combine that with some morels or some spring porcini mushrooms and make kind of what I call a Sichuan surf and turf, which is just, mushrooms from the woods, gooey duck from the shore, mix it all together with some hot peppers and green onions, and it's absolutely delicious.
Nice.
That sounds amazing.
Yes, it's kind of a fun, take on like kung pao. Throw some peanuts in there at the end, and good stuff.
So would you say out of all the shellfish and clams and everything, is gooey duck your favorite then?
It's hard to pick. We have a type of oyster out here on the West Coast called the Olympia oyster, which is our native oyster, actually. And it's kind of a small oyster with a huge flavor. And they were almost eradicated just from overfishing in the 1900s. But they're starting to make a comeback. And my friend John Adams, who I teach these classes with, who owns the property where this third generation shellfish farm is, he has one of the largest native wild populations of Olympia oysters anywhere in the state. And that's a real treat. I just love having those on the half shell with a very simple mignonette. But we have lots of other good things, all sorts of good shellfish, Dungeness crabs, and manila clams, and I mean the list goes on. I love going squid jigging off the town pier, which is another crazy scene. I mean, we do that right in downtown Seattle. in the
That's
middle
amazing.
of the night. Bring your little hip flask of whiskey because it could be cold out. It's usually around this time of year when
Nice.
when the squid are running, and we use something called a squid jig, which is a kind of glow in the dark jig, sort of cigar shaped, that has hooks that radiate outward. So kind of in the opposite way that like maybe a fish hook would, right? And what happens is the squid gets kind of tangled up in it. And I think it's actually trying to mate with the lure. It's not trying to eat it. So it's definitely a case of interruptus there.
Aw.
I know. The squid's trying to get it done, and there you are, yanking him out of the water,
Yeah.
which is why he usually sprays you with his ink when he comes up. But if I try to harvest that ink as well, actually, because that is super delicious.
Oh, it is?
Oh, the squid ink? Oh, yeah. Have you ever had like squid ink risotto or pasta or anything like that?
Yes.
Never in my
Oh,
life.
Yes.
Italian delicacy. Yes, yes. So squidding is a lot of fun. That's something we do here, right? Right within city limits. And of course, I do a lot of salmon fishing off the beach, right in Seattle. We had a big year this year because it was a pink run, and that's a species of salmon. It's the smallest Pacific salmon, and they have a 2-year life cycle, which means that they always come back every other year. And for us down here in Washington, it's in odd numbered years. And so, if it's an odd numbered year that it's going to be a pink year. And this year was a good one. I think they got several million that came back to Puget Sound. And from like late July all the way through September, I mean, it was just gangbusters. I usually fly fish for them right off the beaches in Seattle. And then once they're in the rivers, I'll get my little pontoon boat out and just kind of, I call it my super fun salmon, because they'll be in the sort of lower stretches of, there's one particular river that is Seattle's kind of working river, the Duwamish, and it's the site of Boeing, and all sorts of other heavy industry. And it is, in fact, a super fun site.
Oh,
But,
wow.
those salmon are spending as long as it takes for the tide to change in that water. So
Yeah.
it's not like you're hauling in, fish that glow in the dark or anything. But they do have to swim through it to get to cleaner spawning grounds upstream. And we're there waiting in our pontoon boats and other various tubs to catch them. And they're good biters, so they're really fun on a fly rod, like a lightweight, 6-weight rod, something like that.
For the pinks, what are you using for the larger species of salmon?
So the other species that I focus on a lot around Seattle is silver salmon, also known as coho. And that's really our bread and butter salmon for Puget Sound. And they're often running pretty close to the beaches when they're heading towards their spawning grounds. And in fact, there's even resident salmon in Puget Sound that never, go out all the way to the sort of North Pacific. They're a little bit smaller. By the time they're mature, they're sort of in the 5 to 6 pound range, whereas the fish out in the North Pacific might come in at anywhere from sort of 8 to 12 pounds, something like that. But those silvers are a lot of fun on a fly rod, and they're just so delicious. Both pinks and silvers I like to smoke up in my smoker. But if I get a good fresh silver off the beach, usually that's going to go on the barbecue or something like that. But
Nice.
But if I have a bunch of them, then the surplus gets smoked up. And then of course, there's people out fishing for Chinook, of course. That's not something you need friends with boats for that. And luckily, I do have friends with boats, so I get to go on some Chinook trips. But that's a totally different style of fishing. Most people are using downriggers, fishing pretty deep with pretty heavy rods, and I love getting out my lightweight fly rod and going after these fish. So that's kind of what I focus on.
Are you using a 6-weight rod even when you're catching the larger silver salmon?
For the silvers in Puget Sound, I use a 6-weight.
Oh wow!
When I make an annual trip up to Alaska though, and for that I'm definitely bringing a couple of 8-weights.
Yeah,
and I've definitely broken rods before, so you can get into some really nice fish up there.
So are you using, what type of fly tackle are you using then? Are you using like the roe beads, or what are you using for bait or flies?
Well, so if I'm fishing the beaches, I tie my flies, and most of them are sort of based on clouser type patterns,
Okay.
saltwater patterns.
Yep.
I also do some shrimp patterns and things like that. Mostly pink and chartreuse. Those seem to be the big colors for silvers around Puget Sound. And then when I'm up in Alaska, I tie up these big, heavy bunny leeches and Dalai Lamas and things like that. Some of them are not very fun to throw.
Yeah. What's funny is we catch a lot of smallmouth on the river and use fly rods. And normally it's a 6 or an 8 weight rod. A lot of times 8 weight, just because they fight so much. And
I've heard that. Yeah.
And we use clousers and murdiches the most. And it seems white. They just, in the summertime, like a midsummer, the white, they just attack them on the river. It's crazy how much fight they've got in them.
And so you guys are using saltwater flies as well. That's funny.
I use a weighted, because it's got the weighted eyes on it that keep the hook, under the surface. But then you use like a floating line. Yeah.
Yeah, us fly anglers, especially those of us who tie flies, we like to think that, oh, this is the fly, this is the special pattern that's going to get them. But you know what? All these things are pretty fishy looking to fish underwater. Yeah.
Yep.
But so Langdon, I grew up in, or I was born in Chicago, but then my mom was in the Navy, and we ended up spending 4 years of my life out in Oak Harbor, Washington. Because I lived right on Whidbey Island out there, and it sounds like a paradise you're describing there. And all I ever remember from that time was we went salmon fishing every year when I was a kid, but I was like 10 through 14, so it was pretty cool. But I think I would have been far more engaged had I known that there was all these things that I could dig and all that stuff. So have you ever gone over to Whidbey Island?
Yeah, let me tell you about Whidbey, because the fact that you lived there when you were a kid, you're going to be like, oh man, I wish I'd known about that. So Whidbey is a great place to hunt for chanterelles and lobster mushrooms.
Oh.
Those are two species that really like Whidbey Island. And then of course there's all the shellfish. And Whidbey is also known for its mussels. And there is mussel farming that goes on in Whidbey. So maybe that's why it's known for mussels. But I think there's quite a few escapees as well from the farming operations. So there are lots of places around Whidbey where you can just go and forage for mussels. But you can dig clams. There's berry picking. Whidbey is a great place to be. I can remember actually camping out near Deception Pass, right at the top there. And right in the campground, I think this was like a Labor Day weekend, and I harvested a whole bunch of salal berries, as well as Oregon grape. And we were camped just in the designated campground, and I was going to the bathroom, and there was a cauliflower mushroom right outside the men's room, just sitting there in like a pretty busy campground on Labor Day. I mean, the place was packed, and there was this huge cauliflower. Do you know what a cauliflower mushroom looks like?
Spirosis. That's what you're talking about? That, yeah.
Exactly. It looks like a big bowl of egg noodles, or something that might have washed up at high tide. And they are so good. They are one of my favorite wild mushrooms. Now, the fact that this one was sort of, hanging out by a Douglas fir that was within 10 feet of the men's room, like, okay, that wasn't so great. But
did you pick it anyway?
I actually left it there.
Okay.
But I'm sure it was fine. Around where we live, we tend to find them at the base of big Douglas firs or out at the coast on Sitka spruce. But yeah, they have different hosts depending on where you are and which species it is. But they are, when you saute them up, they are so nutty and delicious. And they have this sort of al dente quality to the texture that I find you can't overcook them. So I like to put cauliflower mushrooms in pot roasts because I really think it's sort of a two-way street. The mushroom will impart all its great kind of mushroomy flavor to the pot roast, but at the same time, it will absorb all the ingredients that you're putting in, whether it's the kind of meat, the red wine, the carrots and celery and onions and all the good flavors there. It sort of soaks all that up, but also, kind of spreads out all of its beautiful fungaliness too. And then, you could have it in the pot roast for a couple hours and it will still have that kind of firm texture, which I think is kind of unusual for mushrooms in general. So they're one of my favorites. I don't find a ton of them. I just sort of find a few. I'm sure if I really targeted them, I know of enough spots where I could probably rack it up a little bit and get a bunch. But generally I just find a couple every season, and I like to just sort of. They're one mushroom I don't really put up. I just enjoy them when I have them, and then that's it for the rest of the year. Whereas chanterelles I put up enough for the whole year. Porcini I put up enough for the whole year. Black trumpets, I dry a ton of those, and they're always, ready to be rehydrated. But with Sporassus, the cauliflower mushroom, it's just kind of a treat that I have in season, and I kind of like it that way,
Yeah. So Langdon, it's funny that you find a couple every season. You say, out here, at least in my group of friends in the mushrooming community here in Michigan, Luke lives in Illinois, but I live in Michigan. Sometimes that's one of those mushrooms that people find once in a lifetime.
Really?
Yeah. So like I only know one forager who's ever found one.
I've actually
so it's pretty special.
Came across them and left them.
Yeah.
Because I didn't. I thought that it wasn't such a sought after mushroom, or it wasn't that worth picking, so I left them. I don't know if that's true anymore. But yeah, I found a couple.
So can you give us some tips then, Langdon? What kind of trees? So you said Douglas fir out there. What about East Coast? What about like somewhere around us? What kind of trees?
So my knowledge is as we head east is it starts to kind of dwindle because, all of these mushrooms that we're looking for, they're connected to trees, right? And that's what I always tell my students. I say, this might sound unintuitive, but if you want to find mushrooms, you have to learn your trees. Mm-hmm. And it's actually where I live in the Pacific Northwest, that's not that difficult. Of course, we have, just huge tracts of conifers, but usually it's just a few species. You might be in a forest with Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar. And then maybe there's a smattering of, big leaf maples and red alder. We're talking about a diversity that you might count on two hands, right? Now step into the woods, say in Great Smoky National Park, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like in Tennessee, where you have the highest plant biodiversity in North America. Right. Yeah. It's just a bewildering, to me at least, being from the Northwest, like a bewildering collection of hardwoods that I look at the bark and I'm just not familiar with these trees, and it's like, how am I going to learn this? And I really want to.
Yeah.
In fact, they have a wildflower festival there at the national park that I've been meaning to go to for years because, we get really excited when our single species of Trillium blooms out here in the Pacific Northwest. I think in Smoky National Park, I think they have something like 32 different species of Trillium. So it's just like, And where I live, like the Trillium means so much to foragers too. It's like, okay, when the petals are white, that means it's time to look for morels. When they start to turn purple, it's time to look for spring porcini. Like we invest all this, into our single species of Trillium, whereas in Tennessee, they've got, a few dozen. So, but anyway, like I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what tree to look under for Sporassus where you live. I was actually just in the Northwoods for the very first time this fall. I went and spoke to the Minnesota Mycological Society. which was super fun. Met some fantastic people and got to hunt in kind of northern Wisconsin, which was amazing, by the way. I can't believe I'd never been there before. I feel like
where?
What's that? I was
Where?
near Cable.
Oh,
Do you know where?
cool.
Do you know where that is?
Yeah, I know exactly where that is.
Isn't that where Tim and Alan Burgo, aren't they around there?
So Alan Burgo came to my talk, actually. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So which was, I guess, that was in the Twin Cities. So he must live nearby there.
Yep.
He lives in St. Paul.
He lives in St. Paul. Okay. Yeah. So he came to my talk, which I think was in St. Paul. But I mean, what amazing hunting grounds you've got around there. And I'd always heard that it was good, but maybe it's a little bit off the radar. There's so many foragers out here in the Pacific Northwest. It's such a thing, especially these days. But maybe, in the Northwoods, maybe you just have sort of the population isn't as dense. There's just so much habitat, so much territory that there just isn't nearly as much competition, maybe. I mean, I'm just throwing out possibilities here. But like, we went to this one area where it was just on a trailhead, I mean, we parked the car, we walked across the street, and I think in just a little opening in the woods, just across the street from the trailhead, we found king boletes, black trumpets, chanterelles, and various species of lactarius, milk caps, all just kind of right there within view of the parking lot. It's just like, it was incredible. And then once we walked into the woods, we were a little bit off trail, but there was a trail nearby. Once we walked into the woods, I think we ended up finding maybe 15 different genera of edible mushroom, like in a space, in an area. I think we just hiked around a few acres, basically. It was incredible. So that's definitely on my list of places to go back to. And I've already mentioned, sort of the Southern Appalachians are amazing just for their plant diversity. Of course, with all these different trees that you have as you move further east, especially the hardwoods, well, you get, mushrooms associated with those trees. So like, we get really excited about finding, our two species of, in the sort of king bolete complex, Boletus edulis and Boletus rex ferus, which is the spring king bolete. But, you go, for instance, when I was in Wisconsin, they were talking about 6 different species in that sort of complex of species that are very similar to Boletus edulis, that all kind of taste like porcini. You can sort of tell them apart, but they all look very similar. But they all have that wonderful nutty flavor and that sort of stately stature, and they're just so much fun to find. And they've got 6 species there, and then you go further east, and the number just climbs, as you get into more different species of hardwoods that these mushrooms are associated with. I think what makes the Northwest really good hunting, it's not our diversity, but the fact that we have these huge tracts of forest with a few species that really produce mushrooms. So, for instance, the Douglas fir is a magic tree. I mean, not only is it our most iconic tree in the Pacific Northwest, it's the timber tree, right? And as a result, we've lopped most of the old ones down, and they built a fair number of the homes, certainly on the West Coast, but probably coast to coast. But we still have these huge forests of second growth Douglas fir that just absolutely, I mean, I think at last count, and I'm sure this has grown since I looked into this last, but I think the last time I looked into it, the Douglas fir had maybe 400 known fungal associates. So for instance, where I live here in the Pacific Northwest, we're, looking under Douglas firs for matsutake, for spiraceus, for chanterelles, of course, that's the most famous. The Pacific golden chanterelle is mycorrhizal with young Douglas firs, especially the young ones, which means that the timber industry has sort of inadvertently created a boom in chanterelles because, they've cut down most of the old trees and replaced them with these kind of tree farms that absolutely grow chanterelles like a crop. And so, the commercial pickers know, where exactly to go to just fill buckets. And so they can go into the woods and on a good day, potentially pick 100 pounds of chanterelles. And so that's what,
pounds?
Yeah, I know, exactly. So,
Yeah.
so that's what gets people salivating about the Northwest. It's not our diversity of fungi, it's our quantities. So we measure mushrooms in poundage as opposed to sort of numerical, numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like morel hunting. I've been in the Midwest hunting morels, and you guys have an amazing morel culture. Everybody knows about morels. In season, any decent cafe is probably serving, a cream of morel soup or something like that. And you have morel festivals. I went to the Boyne City morel hunting contest. This is years ago, but I write about it in my book, The Mushroom Hunters.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody knows about morels in the Midwest. And I've hunted them there. It's super fun. Again, I was a little bit baffled by the trees. You really have to learn your ashes and your tulip trees and some others. But yeah, I found some nice morels in the Midwest. Then you get out here, we especially have this phenomenon where after forest fires, we can have these huge flushes of morels the following spring. And of course, this is even in Seattle, where people think of it as very rainy. But in general, the West, it's an arid climate. We'll have wildfires even in the Olympics, which there are parts of the Olympics that get 200 inches of rain a year. Yeah, I know, hard to fathom that. But we still get wildfires, and then of course you go east of the Cascade Mountains and you're in the rain shadow. It's much drier there, and fire is just a very natural part of the landscape. And so these mushrooms have evolved, to be in an arid landscape, to coexist with wildfire. And so we have several different species of morel that come up just exclusively after wildfire. And the pickers know about this. And so now, morel hunters are fire watchers as well. They're fire hunters. And they keep track of the forest fires and, keep a little notebook. I bookmark things on websites and whatnot, just sort of, especially the smaller fires that might, be sort of under the radar a little bit, that don't get, a lot of notice. And go back in the spring, and there's the potential for just a huge flush. And I have seen pickers, pick 100 pounds of morels in a day, which I know it boggles the mind, doesn't it?
So there's an app called Onyx, and they have burn layers that have historic burn layers, and then it's recent burns. And it's anything and you could set the slider for however many acres. You could do it on Google Earth too, but it's a lot more work. But so in this app, they have that, and you can search that. And I know a lot of people that actually use that for elk hunting and other things as well, because it produces fresh, tender, young browse for the deer, and then, fresh grass and everything else, and clears an opening for the canopy to produce better grass for the elk. And so when they do that, they also find a ton of morels, and they do that in the spring for bear hunting too. So.
Wow.
Yeah, those apps can be pretty useful. It's funny, all the sort of newfangled tools that we have at our disposal. But I will add, just a little cautionary tale. A friend of mine posted on Instagram the other day some shots of his mushroom hunting buddy, who had been lost for several hours on the California coast and eventually got rescued by search and rescue and actually helicoptered out, I think.
Oh, wow.
But it sounds like he lost his phone while he was hunting. So presumably he probably had some GPS app going, and then he lost his phone and had no idea where he was. And so
Thanks.
I always tell my students, I know that you're going to use a GPS app. That's fine. I use them too. But know how to use a map and compass, and bring them with you, along with maybe a few of the other hikers' 10 essentials, have some food and water and some, rain gear and warm weather or cold weather gear, and you want to stay found in the woods. And every year, we get these stories of a guy who was mushroom hunting and got turned around and lost, and is no longer with us as a result.
Wow.
So yeah, and that happens every year. So so you go ahead, use the apps. They're really handy, but have plan B.
Yeah.
Yep.
I use them on the computer a lot to really look at areas, enhance them, blow them up so it's not on the phone for scouting purposes. But it also comes in handy for mushrooms as well. So recently they've learned how to incorporate AI into this. So now you can look at large tracts of timber and it'll actually decipher what it is if you can't tell yourself. So then it'll tell you large oak stand, large this, large that.
It can tell you what species.
Yes.
Wow. Now that is super useful.
If or at least dominant species within the whole.
Sure.
So, but now you can use that for mushroom hunting. And I actually found a new spot for maitake mushrooms recently due to using that technology.
And was that maitake growing on an oak tree?
Yeah.
Yeah. I got to do my first maitake hunting on that trip to the Midwest, to Minnesota.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
And, oh my God, because we don't have them out here.
Clay doesn't have them either.
Yeah.
Don't get Luke started on maitakes.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's when people ask me about what species, I wish we had that we don't. That's always at the top of the list. They're basically east of the Great Plains. And so we don't get maitake, and I have to get on a plane and head somewhere else to do that. But I was just north of Minneapolis, and we found a beautiful maitake. It wasn't one of those huge ones that you sometimes see, but it was still cantaloupe sized and certainly made a good meal for a whole bunch of us. And we actually made some jerky out of it as well, which was really, really good. Kind of a soy Cajun we marinated it before drying it in the dehydrator.
So did you guys boil it to cook it, or how did you before you?
Yes, we did. Yep. Yeah, that's definitely at the top of my list of mushrooms that I wish we had. For one thing, they're just so beautiful.
Yeah.
But they're meaty. They have good flavor. They're fun to cook with. And then, of course, I don't know how much you've looked into this, but they have a lot of medicinal value as well. And I've kind of been getting into that recently. I made my first reishi extract this past year. And
what species?
So we have Ganoderma oregensa out here, which apparently is very similar to Ganoderma lucidum, which is the one that you get in Europe and China. And similar, all the same sort of compounds. And I did a double extraction, double filtration on it, both alcohol and water based, to get all the good stuff out of it. And it's interesting because we think of those as, and a lot of related species, we call them conchs, and they often look like maybe dinner plates or frisbees off the side of a tree, or a rhino horn or something like that, and they're usually hard, right? Mm-hmm. But the reishi Ganoderma mushrooms, you want to get them when they're still soft. And so we went to an old growth forest on the west slope of the Cascades where there was lots of old western hemlock, and they seemed to really like those old hemlocks. And I think this was August, and we found just beautiful specimens, bigger than my hand, with that kind of bright maroon, shiny. They also call it the varnish conch. They have that really shiny top to them, and they were soft. So, I mean, not like really, really soft, but like soft enough that we could slice them with a knife.
That's
yeah,
pretty soft.
And I've heard that people will eat them that way.
Ooh.
We ended up, we didn't eat them. We used them. But there's another polypore that when I was in your neck of the woods, I did eat have you ever eaten the resinous polypore?
I haven't. I've actually never found one.
Do you know what it looks like?
I've seen them in books, but
it's pretty handsome. And it tastes remarkable. I mean, you hear this a lot, but it tastes remarkably like bacon. Seriously.
I could get into that.
Yes. Yeah. We sauteed it up and we just had it with like our, breakfast omelet kind of thing. It was quite good. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
I found a bunch of resinous polypore at the last foraging class that I taught of the year. And in fact, a bunch of people asked me, what does it taste like? And I said, I've never eaten it because it always looks so off-putting to me.
Well, the other thing we did with it was we cut it into cubes and dehydrated those cubes. And they're kind of like, I don't know, little beef stock cubes that you can sort of throw in a soup that you're making or something like that. And they will flavor it and they soften up. And they have, good flavor. So they're fun. And that's another one that I don't see out where I live. Which is why I'm just so sort of privileged to be able to do what I do, to go different places and give talks and teach classes and get to hunt whatever their local, mushrooms and plants are, which is super fun for me.
So are all Ganoderma species actually medicinal, or is there some that you should stay away from?
I don't know of any that are toxic, but some are more medicinal than others. And I think they're being pretty studied right now. Western science is definitely interested in them. They're supposed to have all sorts of anti-cancer properties, among other things. So, they're being actively studied right now. And I know that our local one, Ganoderma oregonsa, seems to be very similar in kind of chemical makeup to Ganoderma lucidum, which is the original. That is the reishi mushroom.
Right. Is that like that?
Yeah.
That's not the antler one, is it? Is that different than the
antler one? Is based on how much CO2 is in the air.
But I mean, that's the one that is the lucidum then, or is that like a tsugai?
Tsugai is only around us.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen that one. I don't know much about that. Then there's another one. Is it called Sichuanese or something like that? Which apparently does not have as many of the desirable compounds as some of the other species.
Yeah, I found a tree loaded with them the other day, and I sent a picture to Clay, and I said, I know it's some type of Ganoderma. I don't know what it is. And I was hunting in the tree right next to that tree that had them all over it, and they were nice, young, tender little ones.
There's the red belt polypore out here that people use to brew beer with. There's all kinds of fun stuff that you can do with them. I am no expert on the Ganodermas.
Okay.
I'm just in the process of learning about them right now. I made my first tincture. I'm reading up on them as, we speak. So I'm no expert on Ganoderma, but and I tell people, every year a few new wild foods land on my plate. This is an ongoing process. Everybody wants to sort of throw around the word expert. I mean, the only reason I get to give these talks and teach these classes is because I initially wrote this book, Fat of the Land, which was really more like stories and personal essays about going out with my friends and going foraging. But I mean, I guess that's more than 99% of the public is doing, and so suddenly you find yourself being called an expert and asked to talk about it. But I always tell my audiences, I'm learning too. And every year there are new species that land on my plate. I'm learning new techniques of how to process, how to cook, how to put up. This is a lifelong pursuit. That's one of the great things about foraging. It's fun to kind of see how it was done in the past and to make connections with sort of Native American foraging styles and see what's kind of still happening or what's fallen by the wayside. certainly there are a lot of foods out there, that I tell my classes, well, that's more of a survival food. You might not want to spend a lot of, you might not want to spend a lot of time, for instance, digging up, the root ball of a sword fern, which for one thing, just trying to get that thing out of the ground is going to be harder than a gooey duck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the size and shape of a pineapple. And then, in terms of the processing, I mean, you gotta roast it, you gotta pound it, you make some sort of flour out of it, in turn you make a mush with that, and it's not that tasty. But it might help you survive a long, wet winter in the Pacific Northwest, a few hundred years ago.
Yeah.
But I'm not spending my time digging up the rhizomes of sword ferns just to be able to say, oh yeah, I've done that. I'm really looking for kind of the tastiest things that are out there, and also things that are just really fun to find. For instance, that Spiraceus.
Yeah. So back to something you said a second ago. You were talking about Native Americans here in the Great Lakes region. When French people came, the Anishinaabe were very, very mycophobic. Can you speak to how the people...
the subject of sort of the Native American diet and mushrooms is really interesting because we just don't know that much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we can read between the lines and say it seems that maybe mushrooms were not a huge part of their diet. I mean, I don't know of really anything in terms of, say, morels and porcini, at least out where I live. But there is one mushroom that definitely figured into, especially the diets of Native Americans living on the Northern California coast, and that's matsutake. So you might know that up in Canada, they refer to matsutake, they call them pines or pine mushrooms. And that's because, they often grow with pine trees, although they grow with fir trees a lot too. So they could be called firs. But anyway, they call them pines up in Canada. Down where I live here in the sort of, greater sort of Seattle area, Washington, Oregon, we mostly call them matsutake or matsis. But you get down into Northern California and they often call them oaks. And that's because when you get down sort of south of probably Roseburg, Oregon, you start and get into places like Brookings, Oregon on the coast, you start to get tan oak. That's kind of the northern limit of it. And matsutake grows with the tan oaks down there. And so apparently Native Americans called them oaks, and they definitely ate them. Yeah. So, but, in general, I would say our knowledge of the sort of, mycophagy of Native Americans is scant.
Well, I know that, for instance, I used to live in Mexico, and central Mexican culture is very heavy in mushroom eating. And then I think also you got Oaxaca and Chiapas and all of them, and they engage in a lot of eating of mushrooms too. But like you said, it's pretty scant. I can't really find a lot of references, especially to things like chaga or, for instance, morels even, or the only one that I've been able to find a lot of information on here that was definitely used is puffballs.
Interesting. Well, Central America is definitely a great place for mushrooming. I'm going to be going to Oaxaca in July, which I'm really excited about. And they have a long tradition of enjoying mushrooms as food and medicine and et cetera. In North America, we live in a more sort of mycophobic place. And certainly, the European tradition here was mostly, especially, sort of the anglicized portion of it was fairly mycophobic, but perhaps that even stretched back to the original inhabitants. I just don't know. But down in Central America, mushroom loving place, Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, I think most of Asia, China is just crazy about mushrooms. I mean, most parts of the world, I think, have long traditions with mushrooms. But here in this country, we're only just starting to kind of figure out what most of the rest of the world has been hip to for a while now. So, yeah. They are awfully fun to find and to cook with, don't you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. When I take my kids out, so I have 3 kids. They all hate mushrooms, but
yeah, that's pretty standard.
But they will totally go out and try to find them. I mean, that's like the thing they love to do. They want to fill the basket up, then they don't want anything to do with eating them.
Scavenger
That's
hunt.
funny. You know, my kids used to call our mushroom hunting expeditions, they called them baton death marches.
Oh, that's rough.
And you know, it's funny because they both sort of lost the thread a little bit of the wild mushroom. But, you know, my daughter is 18 and my son is in his early 20s, and they're just at that age, you know, where they'll come back to it. My wife says that, at least.
Yeah.
They'll come back to it. But when they were little, they did enjoy the hunt. And I do remember a few family conflicts where maybe one kid found more than the other, you know, and it led to, you know, fisticuffs. But you know, they're close to the ground and they have sharp eyes, so they're well suited to it.
I got a question for you in regards to morels. I have a theory that there are some people who are just have what I call morel eyes, and then there's others like me who I just don't. So I've gone out in what people would classify as like great woods for morels, and I just can't find them. and then like somebody else who's right next to me just spotting them left and right, you know. So do you think that there is that, and how do I fix that?
Well, I don't know if I can help you, Clay, but here's some ideas, because some of it, you know, some of it could be genetic. Like it's pattern recognition to a certain degree, right? And so I don't know how one sort of hones that skill, but I can tell you that tree connection that we were talking about earlier is really important. When I went to Boyne City and participated in what they call the world's greatest mushroom hunting contest or something, or morel hunting contest, something like that, at the annual festival that they have there in May, I met a guy who had been crowned the sort of king of morels the first 3 years that they had the contest, and then he retired, you know, and he felt like it was his duty to step aside and let somebody else win, you know. His name is Tony, and he is a great mushroom picker, and we were in his he makes furniture for a living, and we were in his shop where he actually, at the time, he had this incredible 4-poster bed that he had made from the roots of various trees, and somehow nailed it all together, and it still was level and everything. But I mean, it was just an amazing bed that he had made with all these sort of twisting, you know, vines and branches over the top and everything. But anyway, I digress. We're in his shop, and he says, "Look out the window." And I look out the window, and he points to a hill that's maybe, I don't know, a mile away. And he says, "I can pick out the mature ash trees from here on that hill." And he said, "You see that lighter green color?" And I said, "Yeah, I see that." He's like, "I'm making a beeline for that," you know? And it made me realize just how important, not only knowing the tree species, but within that category, you also have to know the candidates. He was looking for the most mature, you know, the biggest. I think they were green ashes. Does that make sense for sort of northern Michigan green ash, or was it blue ash? I can't remember.
Well, you would be talking about my neck of the woods. Boyne City is only like an hour away from me, and
is that black?
So that's
black ash.
Nope, that would be a white ash, because we have black ash.
Oh, was it white ash? Okay,
yeah.
okay. So he was pointing out the ash trees, but within that sort of category, he's looking for the oldest. In fact, you know how morels are they are mushrooms of kind of, I don't know, they're almost like mushrooms of death, which sounds mordant, but you're going to find them in areas of disturbance and decay. They like areas that we have disturbed. Okay, so if we build trails or roads, or if there are fires, that sort of thing, they like that. But they also like trees that are old and going to pieces. Those trees that are sort of dropping their limbs, that are starting to kind of fall down. They might still be alive, but they don't have long. Those are those are often the trees that they will pop up under. So he was looking really for the most mature, kind of long in the tooth ash trees. So when you start to make those connections, and kind of learn to see that habitat from afar, like he would just make a beeline to it. He would move right past all the other trees because they're not candidates. He'd go right for that tree. And then you just spend your whole day doing that. I know mushroom hunters who hardly, they'll park their car and they'll spend a whole day, practically within yards of the car. Like they just make no progress. They're looking down at their feet essentially and just studying the ground, But in fact, if you want to be successful mushroom hunting, you kind of have to be efficient. You have to move. You have to move through the woods. You have to have targets that you're looking for. And when you don't have those targets, you just keep going. So he would breeze past all the young trees and the non-ash trees and the ones that don't fit the profile. And he would go right to those big, old, mature, long in the tooth ashes, because he knew that was his best chance. And then if there was nothing there, he'd continue to the next one, So, and I learned this from, when I was writing my book, The Mushroom Hunters. All the commercial pickers that I went out with, I learned the same thing from them. Like they're moving through the forest at a pretty good clip. They're moving much faster than your typical recreational mushroom hunter, And then once they start to find mushrooms, they settle down and pick. But they're looking for those honey holes. They're looking for those spots where there are lots of mushrooms to pick, not the sort of onesies and twosies as they refer to them.
I've got a buddy that picks probably 300 to 400 pounds of maitakes every year, and probably 100 pounds of morels every year. And I went with him once, and that was enough for me, because he goes through the woods so fast, and he'll just move on. And it's the same thing. He's looking up the whole time. He's looking for dead branches in the trees, and so he's looking for ashes, elms, and tulip poplars, and those are the three species that he looks for the morels. And he's just cruising through the woods, blows by so many other things. I'm like, hey, look over here. There's oysters. Hey, look over here. There's this. And he doesn't care. That's not his mission. And he goes through there so fast. And I'm like, no, that's enough for me. I want to be able to just roam.
I hear you. It's like with porcini mushrooms. I tell people we have a variety of porcini that comes up in the mountains, in the Cascades. Usually kind of late summer after we get some rains. And I tell people, if you want to go pick mountain porcini, just figure you're doing a 12-mile hike. You need to get into the woods and take a trail, because that's the fastest, most efficient way to get deep into the woods. You have to get to elevation. And you got to spend a lot of time kind of looking at the proper habitat. And that means, bypassing the wrong habitat and heading for the good habitat. And if you don't find anything there, then moving on to the next. And, when you find a good spot, well, it's wonderful. You start finding beautiful porcini buttons all over the place. I mean, it's just, no happier moment. But you got to put miles on your boots. That's sort of part of the deal. And you just have to be ready to do that. Plus, I mean, mushroom hunting keeps you fit. You get out there, you're charging around the woods. I love just being outside. So that's a huge part of it for me. But it'll keep you in shape too.
Absolutely.
So tell us about your book, The Mushroom Hunters. It is now out in paperback.
That's right. I'm really excited. It's been a long time coming. It's actually the 10th anniversary, and it's finally out in paper, which is great. It's a book that my wife didn't want me to write. she had heard, the rumors of territorial pickers, of gunshots in the woods, of skirmishes, that sort of thing. And so she just vetoed the idea right off the bat. But I was smitten. I had to write this book. I was just obsessed with the sort of people who could go into the woods and pick 100 pounds of morels. It just seemed, as a recreational mushroom hunter at that point, never having gone out with the commercial guys, it just seemed impossible. Mm-hmm. I think of mushroom hunting as kind of like nature's Rubik's Cube. You have to do all these different combinations to solve the puzzle. And it's soil type and tree canopy and microclimate and weather and all these different factors, slope aspect, that they all go into finding the mother lode. And I realized that these guys they were doing it on a level that I just didn't understand, and I had to get out there with them. But the thing was, really the most difficult thing in the early stages of writing the book was simply finding, my characters, because most people didn't want to talk to me. It's a famously clandestine pursuit, and mushroom hunters could be somewhat secretive about their patches, and really I would discover just sort of in general. And I can remember there was a buyer that I called because I wanted to write not just about the pickers, but the whole pipeline. I wanted to write about the pickers, the buyers, and the chefs, right? The end users. And so I called up a buyer whose number somehow I had managed to wrangle out of somebody. And he answers the phone, and the first thing he says to me is, "Who are you, and how did you get my number?" and I said, "Well, I didn't want to, betray my source, so I just said, well, a friend of mine gave me your number and said that you might be open to just sort of showing me the ropes. Like, I don't want to be in the way. I just want to kind of visit your buy station and watch the grading process and the pickers coming in and how you do business. I'll just stand in a corner and just kind of watch. Okay, is that okay?" And he paused and he said, "It's like with the cops. We're not interested." And he hung up the phone. I just thought, what a wild thing to say, But eventually I would run into both buyers and pickers who were willing to share with me kind of what they did. There was one picker in particular, a guy named Doug Carnell, who I met, and he's been picking mushrooms commercially for like 40 years. He's also captained a crab boat. He's dug razor clams commercially. He's scavenged metal. He's been a logger. He's done all these sort of different things, but mushroom hunting has been sort of the backbone of what he's done for the last 40 years. And I think he actually was willing to talk to me because he was proud of his knowledge and wanted to share it with somebody, who was planning to write about it. He was just very upfront with me. The first time he took me picking, I met him in Hoquiam, which is a sort of down at the heels timber town on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, Western Washington. And we met at the 7-Eleven where he was getting basically, his one shot of nourishment for the day, which was like a huge cup of like a 24-ounce cup of coffee, and he probably had some cold hot dogs in the back of his car. We jumped into his car. It was an old sort of broken down Buick Skylark. He called it the Blue Pig, and he said, "Okay, come with me." And so we drove up 101 on the Olympic Peninsula, and then we got off on a country road, And then that turned into sort of a logging road, and we were on a dirt road. And the dirt road narrowed into what was basically a goat path. And then we crested a rise, and I looked down, and there was a huge puddle, like, bigger, than a swimming pool below. And he said, "Hold your breath." And he just jammed the accelerator, and we went crashing through this puddle, made it to the other side, and he parked the car, and we jumped out, and he got his bucket and a knife that was like 9 inches long, and that he bought at the dollar store. And he said, "Follow me." And, we were in a place in timber country. This was not where recreational people go. There were no trails, there were no views. This was all cut over forest, all second growth, what the pickers call reprod. And, the moment you walk into woods like that in the Northwest, this was late October, early November. It was kind of similar to now. The moment you step into woods like that, you're soaking wet. It's like walking through a car wash, And so he parted the evergreen huckleberry and stepped into the woods, and I followed him through the salal and the old logging slash, and we kind of went charging up the hill, and eventually we ended up on this sort of ridge, and we looked down on the other side, and down in this valley, it was just the creamy caps of hedgehog mushrooms for as far as I could see. Just hedgehogs everywhere. And that first day, I don't know, we picked 40 or 50 pounds of hedgehogs.
That's insane.
No. I think he was getting about $7 a pound for those hedgehogs that day. And I knew right away, this is my guy. So I spent the next 3 years just traveling around the greater Pacific Northwest with him, from, basically, I mean, the mushroom trail, as they call it, extends from basically southeast Alaska across the Yukon, down through western Montana and Idaho, out to the coast of, say, northern California, like at Mendocino, and then up through Oregon and Washington. If you draw a circle around that area, you can basically pick mushrooms somewhere inside that circle every day of the year.
Mm.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. So in winter, they're all down in southwestern Oregon and northern California picking the winter species. That's what they do. Well, the winter species are primarily black trumpets, yellowfoot, which is a relative of the chanterelle, and belly button hedgehogs. Yeah.
2 years ago, I was hauling buckets of wild rice to plant in this beaver pond, and I stumbled upon more hedgehogs than I knew what to do with, and I was like, "What?" I've walked past this place so many times. I get the impression that you guys have mushrooms that are much more reliable, and like where I live, it's very dry in the summer times. So like if we happen to have like a rainy spell in the summer, all of a sudden you can find mushrooms in spots that you've walked by for years and you never saw a mushroom. Well, this one day I filled a 5-gallon bucket with hedgehogs, and it was totally an accident. So that was pretty cool.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, what that means is that mycelium has been there all that time underground, just waiting for its moment to fruit. Yeah. And that mycelium just stretches, it's just everywhere. It's tied in with the roots of the trees, and, as they refer to it as Earth's internet, it's just amazing to think about. I would say that, where I live, we definitely have large quantities of mushrooms. But the thing that I have noticed in 30 years of picking mushrooms is that it's changing. And this is largely due to climate change. And what's happening is what used to be, as you put it, reliable, it's now getting more erratic. So, the fruitings, it's not so much that the seasons are shifting, although there is some shifting in the seasons going on. But more that I'm seeing is that it's becoming more erratic. And so we're having these sort of boom and bust cycles, drought and flood. Last year, we had the worst fall mushroom hunting season in the Northwest that I've experienced in my 30 years of picking out here. This year the fall has been okay. It's been decent. But, we didn't get rain until I think maybe the third week in October, which is totally unusual for this area. And I always tell people that you don't necessarily need the rain for mushrooms. A lot of mushroom hunters think, oh, it's not worth going until it rains. That's not necessarily true. I mean, there are other factors. There's the sort of photo period, there's soil temperature. There are other factors that play into the fruitings. But certainly having a little bit of moisture is a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. And we just didn't get that last year. And so it was terrible. We're seeing this sort of erratic nature of things just more and more. We're having, good years followed by really bad years instead of a kind of a steady, reliable. Mm-hmm. And I really do think that's one of the effects of climate change at this point that I can put my finger on. Something that I have noticed, in the 3 decades that I've been doing it. So in my lifetime, I've sort of seen this change. And we'll just have to see. I've been spending more time maybe hunting in old growth forests because those older forests, those big old trees, they've been around a long time. They know how to conserve resources, right? Yep. So, those are places to look when everything else is super dry and there's nothing going on. You look in those old growth forests and you might find something. But yeah, it's definitely more erratic now out in the mushroom patches.
Very interesting. So, Luke, did you have any final questions?
Nope. I was just going to say, where could everybody find him if they want to reach out to him, talk to him, and where can they find his books?
Sure. Happy to fill you in on that. It's pretty much Langdon Cook across the board. So my Instagram and Facebook is Langdon Cook. My website, www.langdoncook. Trying to think, Twitter, same thing. So, it's just my name, no dashes or dots or anything like that. And I like Instagram because I just like the beauty of just posting a single photo and maybe saying a few things about it, and I try and help people out in season, with what's going on, things to look for, maybe a few little tips or hints about where to look. But, I'm not out there writing really long, involved posts or anything. I just, every now and then something strikes my fancy visually. I'll take a picture and put it up on Instagram. So that's maybe the best way to find stuff for me. As far as my books go, hopefully they're in your local bookstore, but if they're not, well, tell them to pick them up, especially the new paperback of the Mushroom Hunters, which I think they did a great job with. Looks great. Really happy with how it came out. I updated all the taxonomy for the new edition. As I'm sure you're aware, taxonomy in the world of mushrooms is just a moving target. And pretty much everything was out of date by the time, the hardcover went to press. And maybe, I'm sure that all these names will change again because it just seems like, the mycologists love to keep changing names. But no, it's as we learn more about DNA, a lot is changing. So the taxonomy has been updated as best as possible for the new edition. And, obviously, if it's not at your local bookstore, you can find it online at the usual spots.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Can I ask you a question just as a writer?
Sure.
So I really enjoy paperbacks much more than hardcover. Whenever I've got I read a lot of books, and if I have the option, I'm going to pick the paperback all day long over the hardcover. Does that like hurt your feelings as an author? Or is that?
Hey, I'm with you on that because paperbacks can go in your backpack.
Oh, yeah.
when you're out when you're out in the wilderness, and you need a good book for those rainy days in the tent. So I totally get that. But no, I mean, I think they each have their place. I'm glad that the book is now in paperback because I think it'll find maybe a new audience that way. I do love a beautiful hardcover book, and I think that I think they did a great job with the cover of my hardcover edition. I just love the way it looks. So very happy with that. But I think the new paperback looks really great too. And I hope that it's been 10 years since the hardcover came out, and if anything, I almost jumped the gun with the Mushroom Hunters because mushrooms in the most just the last few years have really, and I think especially through the pandemic, I think there was an acceleration of interest in fungi in general. So I almost sort of think that the hardcover might have come out a little too soon for that broader interest, but there's just all sorts of new mushroom hunters out there. I think mycological societies are enjoying a lot of new members, and just there's a general interest. Of course, with the writing that I do, I'm writing for a much larger audience than just mushroom hunters. I mean, it's really a general nonfiction audience. I try and tell a good story. It's all true. I mean, it's I followed these guys through the woods with a tape recorder and a notebook, and I got it all down. And I felt like this was a sort of a shadowy subculture that most people didn't even know exists. And so if you're interested in food, if you're interested in the outdoors, if you're interested in nature, this just should be a book that I would think would resonate with a lot of different readers out there. And you don't necessarily have to be a hardcore mushroom hunter, or a hardcore foodie, because I try and tell a good story. And I think that these characters, I mean, I'm still in touch with a lot of people from the book. And I think they're great characters. They're good talkers. And, I go to some pretty cool places hanging out with them on the Mushroom Trail.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I read your book years ago. I own your book. I love it. I highly recommend it to everybody who has the opportunity to read it. And get yourself a paperback and take it with you. And maybe you need to write a second book and then come back on the show and tell us about it, or a second mushroom.
So, Clay, I think the same reason, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I hated school. So a hardcover book reminds me of textbooks. And I hated textbooks because I wanted to learn. The thing was, it was forced. Everything was confined. This is what you're going to learn. It's structured. This is what you get. And for me, I want to go on different paths. I always wanted to follow my own will and my own way on everything. And by doing that, I think that's why, and maybe that's not why you'd like it, but that's the reason why I like paperbacks more than a hardcover or a hard copy too.
Yeah.
I love that response. I think that's great, And then, of course, let's not forget, there's some people who want the ebook, right? That is the modern convenience, So, hey, I don't care how my readers want it,
Just
there's
read it.
There's lots of different formats. And actually, I will say this as well. The guy who does the reading for the audiobook, and it's not me, unfortunately. They had a professional voice guy do it, but he actually won an award. I think it's called an earphone award for his rendition of my book. He does a wonderful job reading it.
That's awesome.
So if you're into audiobooks, I get emails from people all the time. They're like, "Oh, we're just driving across the Yukon right now looking for morels and listening to your book right now."
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love to hear that. So anyway, cool. Lots of formats out there, and I am happy if you find one that suits you. So
well, thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. It's been amazing talking to you, and like everybody said, read the book. It sounds like an amazing book.
Well, it's been super fun talking to some fellow foragers. And I wish you all full buckets out there, and hope we get to chat again sometime.
Me too.
Yep.
And maybe even get into the woods together sometime. That would be fun.
Absolutely. Anytime.
I need those friends who have my taki spots.
I've got my taki spots. In fact, I'm going to hit some in the morning, not for that purpose, but if I come home empty-handed, I know I'm not going to come home empty-handed with this warm weather we're having. So
that's right. Well, excellent. I will definitely, remember that.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yep.
And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.